My name is. Hello, everyone. My name is Ramana, and I'm usually at UBC, but right now I'm joining from Princeton University, where I'm on sabbatical, and I'm meeting. This is in the traditional homelands of the Lenape people. And I know that most of you are joining us from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam people. And wherever you are, I hope that you take a moment to acknowledge the lands where you are. I'd like to introduce briefly the first of today's speakers, Lindah Ddamba. Lindah is a graduate student at IRES, and her background is in energy and law policy, holding a bachelor's degree in law and a master's of laws degrees from the University of Toronto. And she worked prior to coming to UBC in Uganda's electricity sector as a senior legal officer of the Electricity Regulatory Authority for 4 years. Her thesis is on barriers to energy transitions in Sub-Saharan Africa, focusing on the electricity sectors of Kenya, Uganda, and South Africa. And she will be sharing some of her findings from that research work that she did as part of her master's thesis. It's been a pleasure to work with you, Lindah. So I'm sorry I can't be there for your talk. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Ramana, for that introduction. It has been a pleasure working with you as well. And I just want to take this moment to also acknowledge every single one of you for choosing to be here today. I'm excited to share my work with you today. So to start off, I just want to point out that in 2016, nearly 200 countries agreed to reduce global warming and carbon emissions by increasing investments in renewable energy and reducing fossil fuel use. So a transition to renewable energy is not only feasible, but is also affordable, as we have seen prices for solar and wind reducing. As we've seen prices of solar and wind reducing by 80% and 62% in the last decade. With the declining prices, it was expected that countries would quickly roll out their transition agendas and plans, but that has not been the case in many of the countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. Many of them are lagging behind, and some will not even meet their 2030 deadlines. So why am I talking about Africa today? I just wanted to note that even though Africa contributes less than 4% to global carbon emissions, most of the extreme impacts of climate change are being felt on the continent, mainly because of the underlying vulnerabilities in the region, and which makes it important to study this area and the barriers that are impacting transitions in this area. In my thesis, I explore the factors hindering countries in the region from fast-tracking their energy transitions. I focus specifically on Kenya, Uganda, and South Africa, because number one, South Africa is one of the biggest global contributors to carbon emissions. It also produces 90% of coal that is consumed on the continent, which makes it an interesting case to study. I picked Kenya for one because they have committed to transition their grids to 100% renewables by 2030, which is 2 decades before the net zero deadline of 2050. And then Uganda, my home country where I come from, I picked them specifically because Uganda has been a leading country on the Electricity Regulatory Index for the last 3 years. No, not 3 years. For the last 3 times that the index has reported about best regulators. And it has been ranked number 1 ever since the report was introduced in 2018. So I thought that would be an interesting perspective to share with you today. The study period is between 2015 and 2023. And this is really the period after the Paris Agreement was adopted and the Strategic Development Goals were also adopted. So just trying to look and see how things have changed around that same period. So the research is mainly exploratory, and I applied various qualitative methods to study energy trends and to also look at the literature and discourse on energy transition in the area. And I adopted the meaning of energy transitions that speaks to reducing fossil fuel use while increasing renewable energy, but specifically the World Bank framing on scaling up renewables and phasing down fossil fuel use. But really, I broadly use the term energy transition to but also, as you can see from my concept map, energy transitions are interlinked with the concept of sustainable development, particularly relating to the aspects of environmental sustainability, resource governance, and social resilience. Energy transition is also intertwined with concepts of energy security, energy democracy, and energy justice, which broadly account for the impact of climate decisions on vulnerable groups and the need for inclusive and participatory climate processes. But really, my focus today is on the areas in pink, the barriers to energy transitions in this region. And I have come up with a taxonomy of about 5 areas that I'm going to talk about. That is governance, finance, technology, market, and vulnerability. So on this slide, I talk about climate strategies and pathways, and I classified this in 3, that is aggressive, gradual, and conservative. I note that Kenya has taken on an aggressive pathway, choosing to transition its grid fully to renewables by 2030. Uganda adopted a more gradual process with midterm milestones of 60% by 2030 and 90% by 2050. South Africa, on the other hand, has been more conservative than the other 2, with minimal increases to their renewable energy portfolio within the study period. And the government had also committed to shut down about 8 plants, coal power plants, by 2030. We know for now that that will not be possible given the current challenges that South Africa is facing, and the government is looking to shift that deadline to 2035. So let's look at the trends and the statistics. Kenya, at the moment, 78% of Kenya's installed capacity is renewable compared to 21% of fossil fuels. And most of this is coming from geothermal energy. Kenya is, I think, the 7th largest producer of geothermal energy in the world. And this particular resource has the potential of growing to 10,000 megawatts in the future. And over the study period, as you can see, the share of renewables in the installed capacity has been at about 78. The interesting aspect about Kenya is that when you look at the actual energy that is being generated and supplied to customers, renewables are actually being dispatched at an additional 10%. That is 88% over and above the share of installed capacity. That just goes to show that Kenya is prioritizing renewable energy. And similarly, as you can see, Uganda's installed capacity, that is energy connected to the primary grid, has a share of 92% renewables and only just 7% renewables. And this trend has been the same over the period of study from 2016 to 2021. And on the face of it, it looks like this is a win for energy transitions, but really when you focus in, the biggest share of this is coming from hydro. And why am I mentioning this? This is because hydropower is very dependent on the hydrological conditions of the day, and that is also very dependent on the weather conditions. So when we're talking about the climate becoming worse, I think Uganda does still have some energy security issues. South Africa, which seems to be an outlier, as you can see, is predominantly reliant on fossil fuels, with 70% coming from coal. And this statistic, it is only going to keep increasing because the government intends to develop an additional 1,400 megawatts between now and 2030 to address the current shortages in supply, whereas the renewable energy is not growing as much within the same period. So as you can see, even over the last 6 to 7 years, the share of renewables in the installed capacity has been only about 17%. And when you take a closer look to the actual energy that is being generated, the statistic is much lesser. It's about 5%. And this takes me to the main focus of my thesis, which is the barriers, which I mentioned I classified under five categories. When it comes to governance, I looked at the existence of enabling laws for renewable energy development. And when I looked at the study case areas, I observed that all the countries have sufficient laws. As you can see, Kenya reenacted its primary electricity law in 2019 to make sure that they include provisions that support renewable energy development. South Africa just came up with a just energy transition plan last year, same as Uganda. And the thing about South Africa is that they have a focused program for procuring renewable energy projects through auctions and competitive tenders. However, I did notice a few contradictions in terms of stringent laws and contradictory laws. Just to give an example of a few, South Africa until last year had a local content requirement for all solar modules to be procured domestically. Now, this was inhibiting because the local market does not have sufficient manufacturing capacity. And so this has led to a delay in scaling up solar energy in the country. This requirement was revised last year to 30% because of the challenges that South Africa is facing, and it was reduced to 30%. Uganda also had a policy that halted licensing of solar projects between 2015 and 2021. The regulator put this policy in place to facilitate the off-taker to conduct a grid study and establish whether there was the grid had capacity to take on more variable parcels of energy. And then most of the countries have long-term contracts for fossil fuels, which cannot be terminated without any penalties. And then again, when it comes to governance, I looked at political commitment as articulated through government communications in official reports, official speeches, just to understand the intent and the will of the government in terms of where they see the country moving to. So to start with Kenya, I noticed that the message has been consistently positive, with both incumbent and the previous president confirming that Kenya is on, reaffirming that Kenya will be transitioning its grid to 100% renewable, and basically rallying other countries to join the movement. And so it has been very positive for Kenya. Uganda has been more diplomatic in their stance. The government has consistently supported development of renewables, but at the same time insisting that the country intends to develop their oil and gas resources, and production from the Albertine region is projected to start next year. Yeah. So South Africa, again, is an outlier, I would say, because the messages at all levels of government have been quite negative. And I'll just read a few of these for you to clearly understand why I'm saying that. So according to the 2019 energy report, the government of South Africa quoted that dependency on coal-based energy is unlikely to change significantly in the next 2 decades, owing to the relative lack of suitable alternatives to coal. The Minister of Energy is also recorded to have stated in 2022 that the excitement of moving from coal to renewables is becoming a myth. Many think that renewables are the so-called savior, and we know that it is not. So having shared these messages, it is very clear that the level of government commitment that is being exhibited through the messages that government is articulating across mirrors the transition pathway that each country has taken. With Kenya's messages, you can see that the country is taking on an aggressive path. Uganda is 50-50. There's no urgency to energy transition. And then South Africa, there's a lot of hesitation on whether to move on with scaling up renewables or to develop scaling up renewables or to actually do away with fossil fuel use. So talking about the financial requirements and constraints, the African Development Bank has indicated that Africa as a region will need about 1.5 to 1.6 trillion dollars. Unfortunately, all these countries cannot finance these requirements using their national budgets. And unfortunately as well, most of the global climate funding is not coming to the region because Africa is considered to be very high risk. Looking at technological constraints, I just wanted to note that most of the concerns that were previously raised about, variable sources of energy have been resolved through research and development, except for the fact that in some countries, the grids are not fully developed, like Uganda's, and this affects the amount of variable energy that can be supported on the grid system. Vulnerabilities also continue to incapacitate most countries to move on with their transition, as low to middle income countries do not have sufficient fiscal capacity to address the emerging disasters and at the same time proceed with their energy transition goals. So when we look at the market, we know that the fossil fuel industry is a multi-trillion-dollar industry with a lot of private and public interests. And so when you have such dominant interests, there's always a tendency for the industry to influence policy actors and climate discourse to adopt options that are suitable to the industry. For example, when you look at the language that is being used, we saw a shift from a phase out of coal to a phase down of coal, which is a more subtle approach to the transition. And then there's a lot of lobbying also happening at the international global scene. When you look at what happened at COP 28 last year and the previous one, the numbers just keep increasing. So what are my findings in short? So transitions are basically not uniform, and what I've observed is that each country has basically adopted a pathway that aligns with their economic and political capabilities. And so this calls for, more detailed focused studies that will inform governments to make effective strategies that are going to cause real change in the direction we want to see. And then there's a compounding effect of governance. Governance is key to success. And where you have strong governance, strong government commitment, strong laws, then that means that the investor risk perception reduces, and then investor confidence in investing in renewables also increases. Path dependency is playing a big role, especially when we look at South Africa and Uganda's situation. And breaking this will basically just require unwavering government commitment, but also deep pockets, which requires, among others, strategic partnerships, both within the continent with financing institutions and also strategic partners from all over the world. And then, as we've seen that this transition, the fossil fuel industry is a very indomitable competitor, and to be able to overcome that, most governments will have to rely on fiscal tools to reduce the incentives in fossil fuel investments, removing subsidies to the fossil fuel industry, removing tax holidays, because breaking lock-ins has been one of the hardest things that can happen given the level of economic dependency at the macro and micro level. And then when it comes to resilience, I can only conclude by saying that it is just important to make sure that as we are planning for energy transitions, we can't leave the vulnerable out of the story. We have to look at solutions that are participatory, inclusive, and solutions that are basically going to ensure that no one is left behind. Yeah, so I think my time is done. Generally, that is the summary of my research and my findings. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Linda. I can't see the audience, so somebody else will have to do the moderation and the Q&A.
Yeah, we have about 10 minutes for questions. And if you could just repeat them for the Zoom audience.
Sure. Do we have questions?
No,
Okay.
but if
Okay.
someone asked a question in the room, if you could repeat it for the Zoom audience, or you.
Sure. Yes.
Thanks so much. There were some big right? And they do know, for instance, Kenya has been, having
Should I answer that? Yeah. So the question really is whether I looked at price when I was doing my research. Generally, I looked at the prices of the trends in prices of development of renewables. I did not specifically look at tariffs. This is not a research into the tariffs and market prices for consuming electricity. It is true that both the Ugandan market and the Kenyan market are very price reflective, which means that investments are more or less passed through costs to the end user. They're passed on to the end user. And that has been a very big challenge. I think probably Kenya has a lot of subsidization happening. The government is doing most of the development in geothermal to ensure that the impact on the end user tariffs is very minimal. Uganda has been getting a bit of, has been buffered mainly by the Minister of Finance. Most of the power purchase agreements in respect of projects are being supported by sovereign guarantees. So that is how they've been able to navigate that situation. But it is true that end user tariffs can be impacted. But ultimately, you have to look at that in comparison with the situation that would have been if we continued on the previous trajectory of traditional sources of energy. Because right now, as prices are decreasing for solar and wind, it means that it's cheaper to actually produce. It's cheaper to produce renewables than it would be to produce, for example, oil and gas or hydroelectricity. Yeah, I don't know if that answers the question. Okay, fresh. Let's start. Professor. Okay. Yeah, sure.
Thank you very much. Could you explain the discrepancy in the calculations between the well, you said that the actual delivered, the proportion of actual delivered. How that comes about and what that
So thank you for that question. So basically what's happening is that the installed capacity, the installed capacity, which is the potential for production on the system. Okay, let me rephrase that. What happens is that when it comes to generating and dispatching power plants, Kenya is giving preference to dispatching renewable energy projects compared to fossil fuel plants. It means that even though the installed capacity is about 78%, when it comes to actual production, they're basically making some of the fossil fuel power plants redundant. And that is the case for Uganda as well, because when you look at the 21% of installed thermal power, it's actually being used as backup energy. So the actual generation is 98% for Uganda. I don't know if that clarifies. So there is potential for dispatching maybe a thermal power plant or a coal power plant, but they are prioritizing dispatching renewable energy power plants. Yeah.
I'm just wondering what's behind the solar trajectory in Uganda and South Africa. That's off the theory on that. Is that referring, that's another language referring to a void you know, market saturation, so it's too expensive solar from China or other countries? What's going on?
So I'll start with Uganda. What happened in Uganda is that the grid is relatively underdeveloped. The access rate is about 51%. And so following the rule of thumb for grid systems that the share of variable energy should not be more than the biggest unit of the base load, Uganda was not able to increase the variable energy without increasing the base load. So what happened in 2015 was that the regulator halted licensing to allow the off-taker to do a study on whether they could add any additional variable energy onto the grid system. And also the regulator wanted to come up with a framework for competitive licensing of solar, because most of the projects had been licensed on a first come, first served basis. So, and then to answer the South African part, South Africa's situation is mainly because of historical decisions to prioritize investments in fossil fuel. And so the economy is very dependent. It's very dependent on fossil fuels. There's also pressure from the communities, which are getting a lot of revenue and income, about 91,000 jobs. And so in the short run, there's a lot of pressure on the South African government to maintain these benefits. But as we have seen, most of these coal plants are actually failing. They're not well maintained, and they're not able to supply the required, they're not able to meet the required energy needs. And so there's been a very subtle shift much recently. When you look at the Just Energy Transition Plan, the government is willing to take a longer process, but to at least shift to renewables if the international community will help it to meet the financial requirements of doing that. And that is where the challenge is. But South Africa has currently a very good deal from Europe, the United States, I think even Canada, of about $8.5 billion to finance the Just Energy Transition. This is not going to meet all needs, but I mean, it will start the process. I think yeah. Thank you, Melanie, for that. There was a question.
Just 1 minute left, so a very quick question. And I'll let the next president.
There was a question the other side that I did not. Was it you? Okay. Yeah, thank you. So I picked South Africa, obviously, because it's one of the biggest contributors to carbon emissions. I think it's like the 7th globally, but also it produces 90% of the coal that is produced on the African continent. So that is really huge. A change in South Africa would basically change the overall picture in the region. Kenya, I picked it because it has taken such a daunting commitment to transition to 100% renewable. I haven't heard of any other country that is doing that in the region. So if that happens, that will be a very good precedent that other countries that are struggling with their transitions can emulate. Uganda has been leading in terms of regulatory environment. They've been winning most of the accolades on the Electricity Regulatory Index of Africa. So I wanted to see how the governance component is playing into the picture, how, fossil dependent country is moving along, and how the optimistic side of Kenya is also manifesting, and how that process can impact the rest of the region. Thank you.
Thanks again, Linda.